Thanks for listening to this timely message from Jesus Center. Find us on social media and download our free app. Also visit our website, jesuscenter.com, to find out more information and sign up for our weekly emails. We look forward to meeting you at our Sunday services and hope this message blesses your life.
We are on a series called Deeper Waters, and we want to go deeper in our relationship with God. Perhaps you feel stuck, but that's just an invitation to come deeper. Perhaps you feel dry, that's just an invitation to come deeper. Maybe you're kind of bored right now in your relationship with God, but even that is an invitation to come deeper. And so today, I want to bring a message titled Becoming Prayer. Becoming Prayer. So we know that when we make our requests known to God, or we recite our prayers, it's definitely prayer. The prayer of petition is definitely prayer, but it's not deeper prayer. Paul of Tarsus called one of his congregations to pray without ceasing. And so the prayer without ceasing is the deeper prayer. It's not just a prayer of petition or recitation, because no human being can be uttering requests to God, can be saying their prayers 24/7. But we're called to be living in a state of prayer. So this is deeper prayer. Deeper prayer is not what you say, it is a state. It's not an act, it's an attitude. A deeper prayer is not just an activity that we do, and we engage in a great activity here from 10:30, and it starts at 10:30, by the way, all the way to about 11:10. But we engage in an activity of prayer. But deeper prayer is coming into an awareness, a greater awareness of God, and living from there. So deeper prayer is not just a deed, it's this disposition. It's not in just crafting sentences, it's in the way of seeing. Here's what Henry Nouwen writes in his book, With Open Hands, that prayer is not simply some necessary compartment in the daily schedule of a Christian. This is my favorite part. Prayer is the unceasing recognition that God is wherever we are, always inviting us to come closer. Prayer is the unceasing recognition that God is wherever we are and always inviting us to come closer. So Henry Nouwen is clearly stating that the activity of prayer is not the full spectrum of prayer. He's saying that there's deeper prayer, and the deeper prayer is being able to do all of our activities in the awareness that God is in us, that God is with us, that God is for us, and that God is moving in our lives, and God is inviting us closer to Him. So let me give you an example of the act of prayer. The act of prayer would be saying, God, I thank you for this food. That's the act of prayer. It's the act of giving thanks. You can even do it in a song. And we sang some of our thanks this morning. So that is the activity of prayer. But then the attitude of prayer would be just living with a heart of gratitude. Do you see the difference? You see the difference. So we're supposed to continue to engage in the activity of prayer, but it's hopefully so that we can live from the attitude of prayer throughout the whole day, 24/7. So the goal of our prayer lives isn't just to keep an appointment. The goal of our prayer lives is to reach a higher state of awareness by which we can then live. So the goal of prayer is not just to fulfill an obligation to check it off of your to-do list, but it's to come to a place of being able to live from a oneness with God. So prayer, deeper prayer, is not just firing your array of prayer requests like a machine gun and doing that 24/7. That's not the prayer without ceasing. But deeper prayer is living in the love of God. It's living in the love of God. Here's a quote by Francis Fenelon, who was an archbishop. He was a reformer, a Christian mystic. He says, you pray without ceasing when there is true love in your heart. Love hidden in the depths of the Spirit prays constantly, even when your mind needs to attend to something else. So we know that in this life, our minds need to attend to a lot of different things. There are times you need to clean the house, do the laundry, make the bed. Perhaps you work a job that requires heavy usage of your brain or heavy usage of your body. And so, yet we can live with the love of God active in our hearts and flowing from our hearts. And that means that you have become a prayer. That means you are in the Spirit. That means you are in a deeper prayer, in the realm of deeper prayer. And as much as we can, we want to live from that state where the love of God is just not dammed up, but is just flowing from us. So you may be out and about doing whatever needs to be done, but we can be praying without ceasing. So you may be asking, wouldn't praying without ceasing then take away from the quality of my work? Well, I want to propose that praying without ceasing will actually enhance the quality of your work. Now, there's a professor and a pastor named Greg Boyd, and I was reading his book, Waking Up to God's Presence, and he was saying that in his lecture notes and in his sermon notes, on every page, he'll write, "Are you awake?" ? And so he's always asking himself, are you awake? Are you awake to the presence of God that's in you, that's with you, that's around you? Are you awake to the presence of God? And he says that every time he sees that, he does a little check, and then he tunes into God again. He just comes into awareness of God again, even as he's giving his lecture or delivering his sermon. And he said it actually helps him be a better professor and a better pastor. Have you heard of Brother Lawrence? And he was not a clergyman. He was a layman who worked as a dishwasher in the monastery in France. And people would come from miles around just to watch him do dishes because his face would light up. And in this ecstatic joy, he would do his work. I don't think him practicing the presence of God, and by the way, after he died, there was a book written based on his life called Practicing the Presence of God. But I don't think his practice of the presence of God took away from his dishwashing abilities, but rather it enhanced it. So I believe that verbal prayer, and verbal prayer is very important, but verbal prayer can take away from the quality of your work. But living with this attitude of prayer, living in the Spirit, practicing the presence of God will actually enhance our work. I mean, think about how does a heart of gratitude and love flowing from your heart actually hurt your work ethic? Now, if you're a teacher and your class is taking their midterm or their final exam, and you just stand up on top of your desk and you start interceding for them and warring in tongues, that may not make you a better teacher. In fact, you may lose your job. They may need to check you and check your mental health and your mental state. I guess if you work for the LA Unified School District and you're on strike and you're trying to make a statement on the sidewalk, then you go ahead and war in tongues, okay? But if you're in the classroom, that might not work best for you. Or perhaps you're in sales. And what if you're trying to make a presentation? I think the reason why you should buy this brand new computer is because our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Your kingdom come, because it's got this much memory in the computer. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. By the way, would you like to make the purchase now? Want to seal the deal? I guess if you work for like the Honda dealership, you could just speak in tongues. Just say, you should have bought a Honda, you should have bought a Honda, you should have bought a Honda. Bad joke. All right, anyway, moving on. Or if you are like a dentist and you're performing a root canal, that's not really the time to have your Pentecostal praise party. You got the drill in hand and my Jesus, my Savior. Pass me the other drill. Lord, there is none like you. All of my days, and now you're lifting your hands. You got one drill. I want to praise the wonders. I mean, imagine like you're the patient and you see your dentist having this praise and closing it as wonders of his mighty love, my comfort. And wait until he gets to the chorus of shout to the Lord. I mean, your mouth will be pretty jacked up after that, So I don't think verbal prayer or the act of prayer always helps your work, but the attitude of prayer will. A deeper prayer will. So how do we live in this constant awareness of God's presence and his love? Now, that's a question I'm asking, and it may seem like the answer is really complicated, but I think it's more simple than we think. And I wonder if when we go into the deeper realms of God, it becomes less complex and more simple. I don't think spirituality is like math, because the higher levels of math, it's more confusing, more complicated. But I think the higher levels you go in God, it becomes more simple. For God is not the author of confusion. But living in that constant awareness of God's presence and love may be as easy as just reminding ourselves constantly that God is everywhere and that his love engulfs us. So the antithesis would be forgetting that he's everywhere and forgetting that we're surrounded by his love. You know, I watched the progression of King David, and I believe that when he started to grow spiritually, mature spiritually, and grow in his understanding of God, he came to a place where he started to realize that God is everywhere and that whatever he's doing, wherever he is, God was there and God is there. He's the ever-present God. In Psalm chapter 139, verse 7 to 10, David, he writes, "Where can I go to escape your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol," and that's a really dark place, by the way, "you are there." And David will be the first one to admit, I've been in some dark places, but he says, but God was available to me there. Verse 9, "I will rise on wings of the dawn, and if I settle by the farthest sea, even there your hand will guide me." So God will be available. God will be speaking. God will be reaching out. "And your hand will hold me fast." That speaks of his affections. So David's understanding of God was not that he's a distant being who lives in a galaxy far, far away, but rather God is present. God is available. And God is embracing. So, you know, God is there. You may be in a Sheol right now, in a pretty dark place, but God is available to you now. Now, and this is a reality that we need to wake up to. And I study, again, David's progression and his development. And I believe that when he first started to seek God, we know that he was a very devout seeker of God. God was always in his thoughts. He had a heart that was bent towards God. Therefore, he's called a man after God's own heart. But I think from reading some of his earlier Psalms, he seemed like he saw himself as a fisherman, and God was the fish, and he was just trying to catch God. Like, God, where are you? I look for you. I seek you 7 times a day. As the deer panteth, so my soul longeth to catch you. God, when are you going to bite? God, I thought I caught you, but then where'd you go? And yet, I think as he continued to grow in his revelation of who God is, he came to realize that that's not the picture. That's not the full picture. Maybe this is the activity of prayer, but then he came to realize something else. Let's see the next picture here. That he is the fish and that God is everywhere. You know, in Acts chapter 17, verse 28, Paul says, "In him we live and move and have our being." That's exactly what that fish can say to that ocean. "In you I live, in you I move, in you I have my being." The fish can say to the ocean, "I'm in you, and you're in me." I have some family members who are atheists, and I just love them. I respect them. And, we have good times together, even though we don't agree on everything. But I wonder sometimes if a person, a human being denying the existence of God is like a fish denying the existence of an ocean. Because what the ocean is to the fish, God is to us. And we need to be awakened to this reality that we are a fish in the ocean of God's presence, in the ocean of God's love. And so I think we want to ask this question then, if this is really true, if that fish picture is really reality, and God is truly present around us and in us, then why is our experience often so void or empty of God? Now, our lack of awareness of God's presence is not evidence of his absence, but it's just evidence of our blindness and perhaps our busyness. Ronald Rolheiser said that God is always present. We are just not always present to him. St. Francis says, St. Augustine, said, "You're always with me. It's just that I was not with you." And Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5, verse 8, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." So, when our hearts are so distracted, maybe contaminated, perhaps wounded, we can't always see God who's within us and all around us. Also, when we're so sensually absorbed, we become spiritually oblivious. Now check out this passage in 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 11 to 13. And here's Elijah having a deep encounter with God. Verse 11. And then the Lord said, go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord. Behold, the Lord is about to pass by. And then a great and mighty wind tore into the mountains and shattered the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. I mean, us Californians, man, we're scared of that big one coming, right? Verse 12. And after the earthquake, there was a fire. We've had our share of fires here in the greater Los Angeles area and up there in NorCal. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a still small voice. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak. It was like a prayer shawl. So I should have brought a real one. So he wrapped his head in the cloak because it was the voice that moved him. Notice he's not reacting to the wind, to the earthquake, to the fire, but he's responding to the still small voice. And believe me, I mean, imagine those winds. Those are fierce winds. That's a serious earthquake. That's a blazing fire. The wind, earthquake, and fire, they're more than capable of rattling your senses, of captivating your senses. And I think all of us in this room, we like to have our senses stimulated, don't we? I mean, we travel long distances to behold beautiful sights. We pay good money for fabulous meals. We like to buy things so we can look good. We want to smell good. We like things that smell good. We like things that feel good. We blast the music. You decorate your home. You go to a cafe, a restaurant to have your taste buds tantalized. We like to have our senses stimulated. We're sensual beings. And it's not really something to be ashamed of. God created things for us to richly enjoy. But let's not forget that we're also spiritual beings. And we have the capability to hear that still small voice of God in our spirits. And sometimes we're so captivated or mesmerized by the sensual stimulations of our world that we're oblivious to the spiritual activity of God. I think what I'm trying to say is that we're super attentive to all our physical desires, but we're unaware of our spiritual longings, and we're unresponsive to those spiritual longings. So here's Elijah. He's experiencing a ton of external stimulation, and yet he is not engrossed in them. Rather, he's attentive to his heart, to what God is doing and saying in his spirit. And it's as he hears that still small voice, that voice moves him and he responds. And then he is discerning God. So now he wants to focus in on God, zero in on God. So then again, he covers his head. I bet everyone in this room, you have a busy phone like I do. Your phone's always going off, texts, notifications, emails, you name it. So usually when I'm out to a meal with somebody, I put my phone on the table and I have it face down. You know what I'm talking about? Because a good friend of mine told me that men should not put their phones in their pockets. So, I put it on the table. So I leave it face down though, because I don't want to be just looking at my phone while trying to have a conversation with somebody. And it's to remove distractions so I can focus in on what the person is saying. Now, Elijah didn't have an iPhone to turn off or to face down, but he did have a cloak, so he can really focus in on what God was saying. So he wraps his face. And I think in our world today, in 2019, we have more things that stimulate and captivate our senses than ever before. I used to think that this smartphone was a distraction. In fact, a couple years ago, I actually downgraded to a non-smartphone. And then a friend of mine was like, "What are you doing with that phone?" I'm like, "Well, I just got a non-smartphone." Then he took me to AT&T and bought me a brand new iPhone. I'm like, okay, good friend, but you're defeating my purpose here. But I used to think smartphones were a distraction until my sister got me an Oculus for Christmas. Do you know what an Oculus is? One of those. And so it wraps around your head, And here I am, like, sitting on my bed with this Oculus, trying to watch some basketball, and it's supposed to give you an effect like you're actually in the stadium, and that's why she got it for me, because I'm a huge basketball fan, and so. Here I am, just sitting on the bed, with this thing around my head, and my daughter Eden, who's 4, says, "Daddy, what are you doing?" "Oh, Eden, I'm watching something." "Why do you have that thing around your head?" "Wait, what did you say, Eden?" Because it's got its own speakers. "Why do you have that thing on your head?" "What? Why do you have that?" "What? Daddy, why do you have that thing on your head?" "Oh, Eden, I'm just watching something." And I started to feel really isolated. And I started thinking to myself, this is gross. I am so engrossed in this virtual reality. Now I'm oblivious to who and what's really important in my life. At least when I watch TV, she comes and sits right next to me, or sometimes she sits on my lap and says, "Daddy, who are the bad guys?" Whoever the Lakers are playing. And she goes, "Where's LeBron James?" I'm like, he's injured right now. "So he's not playing?" "No, he's not playing." And then my daughter asked, "Daddy, is LeBron James a pastor?" I said, "No, he's just a basketball player." So then my daughter says, "Daddy, you're better than LeBron James because you're a pastor and a basketball player." And I'm thinking to myself, well, yeah, and we make the same amount of money too, right, Eden? But we're able to have these conversations when at least I'm watching TV, but with that thing around your head, and you're in your own world. I returned the Oculus. The smartphone is bad enough. Sometimes we need to lessen the stimulation of our senses, and we need to put on that cloak like Elijah did, so we can be more aware of the presence of God, the love of God, the voice of God, the movements of God, the activity of God, because isn't He important to us? Remember when the disciples are freaking out over the storm because their senses were telling them about the storm, but Jesus is asleep. So the disciples, they're storm conscious, so they're flipping out, they're stressed out. Jesus is spirit conscious, so He's able to sleep. I want to be more spirit conscious, more aware of God's presence, and less controlled by my senses. In Galatians chapter 5, verse 16, the Apostle Paul says, "I say to you, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh." The flesh speaks of the inferior expressions of human nature, the false self, if you will, the gross parts of us that are not from God, the sin-bent aspects of our lives. And yet, Paul, he doesn't say wrestle the flesh. He says walk by the Spirit. He doesn't say fight the flesh. He says walk by the Spirit. And then consequently, you will not fulfill the desires of the flesh. Because I think it's easy to get into a wrestling match with what Paul refers to as flesh. We want to wrestle our lust. We want to wrestle our pride. We want to pin down our greed. We want to destroy our own maliciousness. I mean, you ever see these things surfacing in your life? I do. Your own rottenness. And I think that those intentions to go into the ring and wrestle the flesh is noble, but the approach can be ineffective because Paul doesn't say fight the flesh. He says just walk in the Spirit, and then the flesh will be defeated. So our primary pursuit each and every day is to walk in the Spirit, is to live from this awareness of God's presence and love, to see yourself as that fish and recognize that you're surrounded by an ocean around you and an ocean within you. Jesus told His disciples in Matthew chapter 26, verse 41, watch and pray so you will not fall into temptation. He didn't say, don't fall into temptation, you idiots. He just said, watch and pray. Because if you watch and pray, you will not fall into temptation. To watch means to stay awake. Remember, Greg asked himself the question, are you awake? Are you awake? Are you awake? Let's remain awake to God's presence and love. So be present to the ever-present. That's living in the Spirit. That's deeper prayer. That's prayer without ceasing. And that's when we have become a prayer. So, when we're awake, we don't have to worry about falling into temptation. We fall into temptation when we are asleep. So here's a quote by Madame Jean Guyon. And by the way, she went to prison for her books on prayer. Her books are good. She went to jail for those. But this is what she writes in one of these books. that your main concern lies in continually acknowledging the God who is within you. And then, practically, without thinking of self-denial or putting away the deeds of the flesh, God will cause you to experience a natural subduing of the flesh. So now I have a question. What do you do when you catch yourself asleep to the presence of God? When we are asleep, we are quite unaware. Here, I have a picture up here on the screen of somebody sleeping. She probably has no idea of what's going on around her. She has no idea of who's around her. I really wanted to put a picture of Meg, but then I didn't want to sleep on the couch either, so I didn't. But I like taking pictures of, man, when she and Eden are sleeping like right next to each other, they're twins. They look identical, but anyhow. So I wanted to show you one of those pictures because I think it's adorable, but somebody else doesn't. So anyway, have you ever met someone who denies that they snore? And you're thinking, you know how oblivious you are when you're snoring? Of course you don't know that you're snoring. But when we wake up, we become cognizant of our surroundings. So it's time for us to wake up. We need to continually be waking up to God, who is our surrounding. He's our ever-present surrounding. That's a great reality to wake up to. So when you catch yourself asleep to the presence of God, we don't have to worry. Just redirect our attention to God. I think sometimes we can beat ourselves up. Oh, I've been asleep, to this reality. And yet, sometimes when we're just beating ourselves up, we're just obsessing with ourselves. And obsessing with ourselves continues to perpetuate our obliviousness to God. And so we want to, not get into this narcissism of self-condemnation. But let's just, so don't worry about it, okay? You've been asleep to God, don't worry about it. Let's just redirect our attention to God. Let's just wake up to God. Here's a quote by Brother Lawrence, and I love this. And because people were asking him about how he practices the presence of God, and this was in the book, Practicing the Presence of God. If your mind sometimes wanders or withdraws from the Lord, do not be upset. So don't be troubled or disquieted, because being troubled and disquiet serve to more distance the mind further from God than to recollect it. So rather, we must bring the mind back into tranquility, back into peace, or back into that awareness. Remember, it says, he'll keep him in perfect peace whose mind is stayed on thee, on him. So you come into tranquility when you refocus on God and when we're awake to him again. So we want to bring ourselves back to the pleasant awareness of the presence of God. I just want to end with this. You're not going to be able to live in a prayer closet 24/7. But we can live in that awareness of the presence of God, the love of God. And we can live from that attitude of prayer. We won't always be able to say our prayers, but we can become a prayer. So, we go to work, probably a lot of us from Tuesday. We got responsibilities. If you're like me, you have deadlines all the time, and it never stops. You're caring for your families. Probably all of us, we feel like we're juggling like 18 different things every single day. But I just want to encourage us, let's be awake to God. Let's be conscious to the presence and love of God that engulfs us. In him we live and move and have our being.
Thanks for listening to this timely message from Jesus Center. Find us on social media and download our free app. Also visit our website, JesusCenter.com, to find out more information and sign up for our weekly emails. And hope this message blesses your life.